I was born on January 1st, 1924, into a world that had already learned the price of $1. The grocery my grandfather ran in Omaha smelled of coffee and sugar, and it taught me two things before I ever sat in a classroom long enough to learn them formally. Scarcity sharpens the mind, and work without complaint shapes character. Those early hours behind the counter, stocking shelves, making change, watching the ledger, were the first lessons that later became rules I depended on when life stripped me down to essentials. There is a paradox baked into my life that people like simple stories to miss. The tragedies did not make me rich. They forced me to become the kind of person who could see value, take disciplined risk, and endure the boredom and humiliation that precede success. That's the arc I want to trace here. The small, brutal choices that turn loss into rigor, the habits that compound long after luck has run its course. If you care about stories of resilience and practical thinking, stick around. There's a lot to learn and very little sentiment to get in the way. My grandfather, Thomas Charles Munger, was a judge. He believed in order and in consequence. He also believed, in his own way, that education was the quiet currency of a life. I took that currency seriously. I got into the University of Michigan, I studied, and the war interrupted and redirected me. Meteorology training, service in the Army Air Corps, the kind of disciplined scientific thinking that later made me allergic to fuzzy reasoning. I've always been suspicious of intuition that can't be backed by a chain of cause and effect. Science trained me to demand that chain. After the war, I went to law school, Harvard Law, and then to practice. I married Nancy Huggins. I worked hard and fast. I liked argumentation and structure and the clarity of contracts. In those years, I expanded quickly as a lawyer. Success has an appetite, and I fed it. But expansion without reflection can be a trap. The rapid growth of one's professional life can mask fissures at home and blind a man to the fragility of what he holds dear. The year I turned 29 marks a period I'm not proud to sentimentalize. I was divorced with less custody than I would have liked, and I felt the weight of humiliation and failure in ways that were new to me. I had done well on paper, but paper tolerates a lot. Real life demanded more. The collapse was not the dramatic Hollywood moment. It was a sequence of small defeats. A courtroom loss here, a relationship strained into cracks, the slow hemorrhage of confidence. I learned then that humiliation can either bury a man or be the ore from which resolve is smelted. My choice was deliberate. I decided not to let grief be my identity. The worst thing that ever happened to me was the death of my son, Ted. He was a bright, ordinary boy, and leukemia took him. The bills piled up. The grief was uncomplicated and complete. There are losses that break you and losses that reconstruct you, and I will not pretend to be noble about it. The pain was raw and real. But after a period of collapse and mourning, I reached a line of clarity I still quote: never feel sorry for yourself. That line is not moralizing. It is a pragmatic rule. Self-pity is a tax on energy and a guarantee of wasted potential. When everything that could be taken from you has been taken, you have a stark choice. Lie down in the wreckage or use what's left to build something worth having. I returned to Omaha. I remarried Nancy Berry, and with a fresh domestic foundation, I began to rebuild. The reconstruction was not mystical. It was methodical and often painfully slow. I went back to the mind tools that had saved me before: Read voraciously, learn broadly, think deliberately, and avoid the seductive comfort of action for action's sake. My earliest investments were not in grand theories, but in dirt, real estate. I learned early that leverage combined with active control is a powerful formula when used modestly and sensibly. We bought land near Caltech, small parcels that, because of timing, location, and a few decisions others didn't make, appreciated in ways that outstripped what we could have predicted. The point was not the windfall itself, it was the pattern it taught. Find where you have an informational edge, use leverage you can manage, and prefer situations where you can influence the outcome. That pattern carried over to partnerships. I formed a partnership with Willa, a man whose temperament suited mine, and we began buying businesses. We didn't pretend to be all-knowing. We preferred concentration over diversification when we were confident, because diversification is for people who don't know what they're doing. Concentration rewards conviction, grounded in knowledge. At the same time, we learned to respect our limits, what I later called the circle of competence. You must know the edge of that circle, and you must refuse to step beyond it because your ego demands it. Warren Buffett came into my life like a mirror. We reflected different strengths back to each other. He had a temperament almost allergic to being rushed, and he had a clarity about business that complemented my contrarian leanings. We argued often and precisely, and from those arguments came better decisions. I had started leaning toward buying quality businesses, even at fair prices, and Warren was willing to listen. For him, long-standing patterns of buying cheap securities had worked brilliantly, but the addition of a principle that prized durable economics and competent management changed the calculus for the longer term. We found that buying a wonderful business at a fair price was often better than buying a fair business at a wonderful price. One small company taught us a large lesson: seize candies. It was not glamorous. Romantic investors chase growth stories with flashy multiples. We bought something that made money selling chocolates in well-run stores. The return on that investment was less about a single brilliant transaction and more about compounding an advantage, a strong brand, simple economics, reasonable pricing power, and an operator who took care of his business. C's produced steady cash flow, and that cash flow allowed us to buy more things, more gardens in which to plant our capital. But perhaps the most valuable lesson from C's wasn't the return itself. It was how owning a durable, well-run company reshaped how we thought about value. A business that pays you to wait is a precious thing. Litigation to defend a business's franchise, like taking on imitators who would water down the brand, was worth it. You don't have to defend an asset. You treat a franchise as something you must preserve actively. We had other bets that taught bruising lessons. British Columbia Power was one of those high-conviction positions where leverage and timing intersected to produce both outsized gains and the risk of outsized losses. We believed in predictable cash flows and regulated utilities. We financed and structured in ways that magnified upside. That approach works when rates, regulation, and the broader economy cooperate. When they don't, leverage amplifies the pain. I learned again that conviction without humility is dangerous. The margin for error exists only when you manage your leverage and do not confuse optimism with omniscience. Markets teach the same lessons repeatedly until you learn them. The bear market of 1973-74 was a particularly bitter instructor. We took losses that were both financial and ego-driven. Partners who had trusted our judgment were disappointed. I had to face a truth that scale was a two-edged sword. What's easy to outperform with 10 million becomes nearly impossible with $1 billion. Volatility hurts confidence, and it forces hard choices, like whether to liquidate a partnership or to ride out the storm. We chose to dissolve a partnership at a painful time, and that experience taught me as much about investor psychology as it did about arithmetic. People expect consistency, but consistency in a world driven by randomness is an illusion. The right aim is to build systems that, across cycles, allow you to survive and to take advantage when others panic. That lesson about scale, about the psychology of investors, about humility, helped shape the further evolution of our approach when Berkshire Hathaway emerged as more than an odd textile company. The machine we built at Berkshire was deceptively simple. Buy outstanding businesses with durable cash flows, use their profits to buy additional businesses, and compound in a manner that makes reinvestment the primary driver of wealth. The people who run the operating businesses are as important as the capital allocator sitting in the central office. Over decades, the compounding of retained earnings, guided by patient capital allocation and relentless reading, turned a modest enterprise into an economic engine of extraordinary scale. Call it what you like, legacy, empire, or simply an accumulation of choices. But by the time the world took notice, the consequences had multiplied far beyond the sum of individual transactions. Let me be blunt. Scale creates constraints. With every increase in assets under management, the menu of attractive opportunities narrows. You cannot buy tiny mispriced securities and expect to move markets without changing the game. The arithmetic becomes against you. That realization forced a strategy shift. If you cannot outperform by nimble trading, you must outperform by selecting businesses whose economics are so favorable you can purchase them meaningfully and still grow. That is where our emphasis on high-quality businesses, on moats and franchises and honest management came from. People often ask whether the tragedies were necessary. They are not. Pain isn't a necessary precursor to wisdom, but adversity does sharpen priorities. After Ted's death, after the divorce, after the bankruptcies and humiliations, I had fewer illusions about what mattered. The energy spent on self-pity was gone, and that energy had to go somewhere. I channeled it into work, reading, thinking, arguing with people who made me better, and engaging in investments that were intelligible within my circle of competence. The tragedies didn't directly generate money. They narrowed my focus until what remained became fiercely productive. I'll give you a short list of rules that came out of those years, rules I would trust more than any sudden insight or hot tip. First, never feel sorry for yourself. It is not a platitude. It is a way to remain useful. Self-pity leads to paralysis, and paralysis is the road to missed opportunities. Second, read widely and think in models. The world is made comprehensible by a lattice of multidisciplinary ideas. Economics, psychology, and history illuminate one another. If you want to make better decisions, habitually replace slogans with models. Third, know your circle of competence and respect its boundary. It is better to be largely right in a small area than occasionally brilliant in areas you do not understand. Concentration within competence beats diversification outside of it. Fourth, prefer quality over price when the economics are obvious. A wonderful business at a fair price often outperforms a fair business at a wonderful price over long horizons. Fifth, protect your downside with humility about leverage. Leverage magnifies gains and losses. Never confuse the possibility of glory with an absence of risk. Sixth, be patient. Time is a friend to the patient compounder and a hazard to the impatient speculator. Cash flow producing assets that allow you to wait are a strategic advantage. There are examples that crystallize these rules. See's Candies taught patience and the power of a franchise that pays you while you wait. Our real estate investments taught the lesson of leverage plus control in a setting where local knowledge mattered. The British Columbia Power investment taught the humbling arithmetic of leverage and regulatory risk. The 1973-74 losses taught the hard cap that scale imposes on the methods that worked when we were smaller. Together, these episodes built a framework that informed the Berkshire approach. Buy good businesses, reinvest their earnings wisely, and do not mistake past luck for replicable skill. I have a reputation, some deserved, some exaggerated, for being blunt and for favoring aphorisms. I like rules because they force you to act in a world full of seductive half-truths. But rules without judgment are dangerous. The rule of becoming worthy is a phrase I've used. Earn the right to what you want by becoming the kind of person who can keep it without destroying others in the process. Wealth without worth is fragile. Earned competence and intellectual humility are the foundations that sustain it. There are misconceptions about my life that irk me less for their inaccuracy than for what they obscure. My life wasn't a straight line from trauma to treasure. It was a long sequence of small decisions, failures, corrections, and occasional strokes of good fortune. I did not become wise because I suffered. I became disciplined because suffering removed certain options from the table and clarified the remaining ones. That clarity is what I credit for the outcomes. If you ask whether someone can take the same steps today and replicate that arc exactly, no. Conditions change. Scale creates new constraints. The competitive landscape is different, but the process remains valuable. Read more, think better, understand the arithmetic, cultivate patience, and never let grief become an identity. One last point on moral posture. It's too easy for success stories to become vanity projects that forget the people and the rules that made them possible. I have been fortunate, privileged in ways that matter, with partners who hacked at problems with me, and with a family that rebuilt and supported me in quiet ways. The wealth that accrues to any person is the result of 1,000 small acts, many by others. Recognize that, and let it keep you modest. When I look back on the line from that counter in my grandfather's grocery to the large, unwieldy machine Berkshire became, I see continuity. The early lessons in work, the scientific training that demanded clear thinking, the resolve hardened by grief, and the relentless preference for practical over elegant theories. Those are the threads. Tragedy supplied the fuel, but discipline provided the engine. The tragedies turned me into a man who would read incessantly, who would refuse to be ruled by sentiment, who would prefer a business that paid him to wait over a story that promised instant riches. That transformation is the causal link the title claims. Not that sorrow birthed money directly, but that sorrow forged habits and judgments which, compounded over decades, generated extraordinary results. If you want to go deeper into the specifics, how See's Candy's scaled distribution, how we structured purchases, how the partnership with Warren evolved. There are longer treatments and biographies that lay out the transactions and numbers in detail. You'll find references in the description. Read the history, but don't forget the point. Numbers alone are blind. They mean something only when you pair them with a mind trained to see the underlying economics. To close, let me leave you with 5 practical principles to carry forward. 1. Cultivate a durable disposition. Replace self-pity with purposeful work. Hardship should narrow your focus, not scatter it. 2. Build and stay within a circle of competence. Know what you understand deeply and bet there with conviction, not with hubris. 3. Prefer businesses that pay you to wait. Cash flow and franchises buy you the greatest asset, time. 4. Use leverage sparingly and sensibly. It magnifies both right and wrong decisions. Humility is the best defense. 5. Read and think in multiple models. The lattice work of ideas reduces the chance of catastrophic error. Those are the tools that allowed misfortunes to become fuel for a life's work. They are not a guarantee of riches. They are a set of disciplines that increase the odds of good outcomes. I learned them the hard way. If you find them useful, follow up on the longer accounts and case studies linked below. There is no substitute for patient study.